The Moche sacrifice ceremony. The year is approximately 500 CE. You are standing at the base of a sun-dried mud brick pyramid on the northern coast of Peru, in the valley the Moche people call home. The Pacific wind carries salt and dust across the desert plain. Above you, the Huaca de la Luna rises 40 meters into the bleached sky, its painted walls depicting scenes in vivid red, white, and black that archaeologists would spend decades trying to understand. Warriors with ropes around their necks, a priestess holding a goblet, blood. For roughly 700 years, something happened at this pyramid that the Moche considered so essential, so cosmically necessary, that they never stopped doing it. And when archaeologists finally matched the painted scenes on thousands of ceramic vessels to the physical evidence buried in the platforms and plazas below, the picture that emerged was unlike almost anything else in the ancient world. This was not occasional ritual. This was not crisis response. This was an institution running continuously, generation after generation, for longer than the entire history of the United States multiplied by 3. The Moche culture flourished along the northern coast of Peru from approximately 100 CE to 800 CE, making it roughly contemporary with the height of the Roman Empire on the other side of the planet. They built 2 enormous pyramid complexes, the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, in the Moche Valley near present-day Trujillo. But the Huaca del Sol alone required an estimated 140 million adobe bricks, placed by a rotating labor force drawn from communities across the region. This was a civilization of serious organizational capacity. Art historian Christopher Donnan of UCLA spent years in the 1970s cataloging Moche ceramic art and identified a recurring scene he called the sacrifice ceremony, depicted with remarkable consistency across hundreds of vessels spanning centuries of production. The scene always contained the same elements: a bird-headed figure, a rayed warrior deity, bound prisoners, and a female figure holding a tall goblet. Donnan proposed that this was not mythological decoration, but a depiction of an actual ceremony. Most of his colleagues were skeptical. Then the shovels went into the ground. Excavations at the Huaca de la Luna, led by Santiago Ucheda Castillo of the Universidad Nacional de Trujillo, beginning in the 1990s, uncovered what amounted to a sacrificial processing area within the pyramid complex. Physical anthropologist John Verano of Tulane University analyzed the human remains found there and identified at least 70 individuals killed and processed at a single deposit, with cut marks, disarticulation, and defleshing evident across the skeletal assemblage. These were not people who died in battle and were buried at the pyramid. They were brought here to die. The victims, predominantly young adult males, showed healed injuries consistent with warrior status, confirming they were active combatants captured specifically for sacrifice. Strontium and oxygen isotope analysis of their tooth enamel confirmed that many were not local to the Moche Valley. They had been transported from other regions within the Moche sphere of influence, sometimes from considerable distances, to be killed at this specific location. The logistical apparatus required to capture, transport, and process these individuals continuously for 7 centuries was, by any measure, extraordinary. In 1991, archaeologist Luis Jaime Castillo Buters of the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru excavated the tomb of a high-status woman at the site of San José de Moro, not far from the main pyramid complexes. The burial was extraordinary. Surrounding the central figure were the dismembered remains of sacrificial retainers placed there deliberately. The woman herself was buried with goblets matching the vessels depicted in the ceramic sacrifice ceremony scenes. Donnan's decoded iconography had predicted she would exist, and there she was. Subsequent excavations at San José de Moro identified at least 3 distinct priestess burials of this type, spanning roughly the 7th to 8th centuries CE. Each was accompanied by sacrificial victims and ritual regalia matching the ceramic tradition. The presiding figure of the Moche sacrifice ceremony was not a king. It was not a general. It was a woman holding a goblet of blood, standing at the center of a 700-year tradition that the entire civilization organized itself around. Mainstream archaeology interprets the Moche sacrifice ceremony as a political religious institution designed to maintain cosmic order and reinforce elite authority. The blood of captured warriors, consumed by the priestess in her role as divine intermediary, was understood to feed the gods, ensuring continued agricultural fertility, military success, and the stability of the world itself. This is not an unusual framework. Many ancient cultures practiced human sacrifice within cosmological belief systems, and the Moche version, however elaborate, fits recognizable patterns of ritual violence tied to elite power. But 700 years is not a pattern. 700 years is a fact of civilizational identity. This ceremony outlasted every political disruption the Moche experienced, including what appears to be a significant restructuring of their political authority in the 6th and 7th centuries CE. Whatever belief system sustained it was not flexible or negotiable. Stopping it was apparently unthinkable. What does a society have to believe, at the deepest possible level, to maintain an institution like this for longer than most civilizations exist at all? Some researchers have begun asking whether the role of the Moche priestesses represents a form of female authority that conventional models of ancient society consistently underestimate. These women did not merely preside over ritual. They commanded the apparatus of sacrifice, the logistics of captive acquisition, the architectural spaces in which the ceremony occurred, and the artistic tradition that encoded and transmitted it across generations. Could they have held not just spiritual power, but genuine military and political authority, expressed through the absolute control of death? And if so, what does that tell us about the range of social structures that prehistoric civilizations were actually capable of producing? We may never know what the Moche believed they were achieving. They left no writing. Everything we know comes from their art and their bones. But the bones are very clear. For 7 centuries, down the northern coast of Peru, people were brought from across an empire to die inside a painted pyramid, and the institution that brought them there never wavered. From the Pacific coast of South America, we crossed to the opposite side of the world, moving north and east into Central Asia, into one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, where the sand has been hiding a population of people who, by every scientific measure, had absolutely no business being where they were found. The Xiaohe mummies. The Taklamakan Desert in the Tarim Basin of western China is not a place where things survive. It is one of the driest environments on Earth, a vast interior basin surrounded by mountain ranges that block moisture from every direction. Temperatures swing from extreme heat to extreme cold. The wind moves the sand in waves. It is the kind of place where civilizations are not supposed to take root. And yet, emerging from that sand, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing through excavations in the early 21st came bodies, preserved bodies, bodies with light-colored hair, tall frames, and genetics that placed their ancestry not in East Asia, but somewhere far to the west, in a population that, as of the most recent analysis, has no confirmed point of origin anywhere in the known archaeological record. Swedish explorer Sven Hedin first reported mummified remains in the Tarim Basin in the 1890s. Formal excavations were conducted by Swedish archaeologist Folke Bergman at the Xiaohe Cemetery beginning in the 1930s. The site was then lost beneath shifting dunes until it was rediscovered in 2000. Major excavations by the Xinjiang Archaeological Institute between 2002 and 2005 recovered more than 200 burials from a site arranged in a striking layered pattern. Boat-shaped wooden coffins stacked one atop another across multiple levels of use spanning centuries. The mummies themselves were extraordinary. The extreme aridity of the Tarim Basin had preserved not just bone, but skin, hair, textiles, and organic grave goods. Hair colors ranged from dark brown to reddish brown to what appeared, in some cases, to be variants of fair coloring. The textiles found with the bodies were equally startling. Some featured plaid and twill weave patterns that were essentially identical to Bronze Age weaving traditions documented in Europe and Western Eurasia, found here in Chinese territory at approximately 1800 BCE, centuries before any known overland trade route connected these regions. DNA analysis by a team led by geneticist Chengxiang Li, published in BMC Biology in 2010, identified both Western Eurasian and East Asian maternal lineages among the mummies, confirming that the population was genetically mixed in ways that defied simple regional categorization. But the landmark finding came in 2021, when a team led by David Reich at Harvard Medical School published a comprehensive ancient DNA analysis of the earliest Tarim Basin individuals. Their conclusion was striking. The oldest mummies, dating to approximately 1800 BCE, did not descend from any known neighboring population. They belonged to a genetically isolated ancient North Eurasian lineage with no detectable admixture from surrounding groups in China, Central Asia, South Asia, or Western Eurasia. They appeared to have been in the Tarim Basin for a very long time, isolated from the rest of humanity, representing what the researchers described as a relic population of an ancient dispersal event whose origins remain unknown. The boat-shaped coffins at Xiaohe added another layer of strangeness. The Tarim Basin is entirely landlocked, surrounded by mountains and desert, but with no navigable waterways anywhere near the burial site. And yet the people buried there chose boats as coffins, perhaps preserving a cultural memory of a homeland near water, a landscape so distant in time or space that its actual location had been forgotten, leaving only the symbol behind. Chinese government access to the mummies and their genetic analysis was restricted for years. The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, where the mummies are held, is one of the most politically sensitive areas in modern China, and the existence of a non-Chinese indigenous population in the region carries obvious contemporary implications. International researchers reported significant difficulty gaining access to the remains and to existing data during certain periods, and the 2021 Harvard study was itself the product of years of negotiation and collaboration with Chinese institutions, and was framed carefully to avoid the political minefield surrounding Xinjiang's history and identity. Mainstream archaeology, informed by the 2021 analysis, concludes that the early Tarim mummies were not migrants from Europe or Western Asia. They were a genuinely indigenous population, isolated for thousands of years in the Tarim Basin, whose ultimate ancestral origin traces back to ancient population movements that are not yet fully mapped in the genetic record. This is the scientific consensus. It is also, in its own way, more mysterious than the alternative theories it replaced. But if this population was truly isolated, if they arrived in the Tarim Basin from an unknown point of origin and then had no significant contact with surrounding populations for centuries, what happened to them? The genetic record shows that by the first millennium BCE, the population makeup of the Tarim Basin had shifted significantly, with Central Asian genetic signatures becoming dominant, the isolated A and E lineage of the earliest mummies essentially disappears. Absorption into later incoming populations is the standard explanation. But the Tarim Basin did not easily admit outsiders. The mountains and desert that isolated the early population from contact would have equally impeded later conquest. Something ended the isolation. Something changed. Some researchers working outside the constraints of Chinese institutional archaeology have asked whether the disappearance of this population from the genetic record reflects not peaceful absorption, but displacement or destruction. A chapter of Bronze Age violence buried under both the sand and the politics of a modern state that has significant reasons to prefer certain historical narratives over others. We may never have unrestricted access to the full archaeological record of Xinjiang, and that absence of access is itself a kind of evidence, though of what exactly remains an open question. From the hidden desert of central China, we travel west and north, back into Europe, back to the cold islands off the Scottish coast, where archaeologists made a discovery that is not about violence at all, and is somehow, for that reason, even more disturbing. The Clad Hallan mummies. The island of South Uist in the Outer Hebrides sits at the northwestern edge of Europe, battered by Atlantic wind and rain, a landscape of low hills and peat bog, and the kind of gray sky that makes time feel irrelevant. Around 3,000 years ago, people were living here in substantial roundhouses, farming, fishing, building communities that would persist for centuries on the same ground. When archaeologists from the South Uist Archaeological Project, led by Professor Mike Parker Pearson of University College London, excavated 2 skeletons buried beneath the floor of one of these roundhouses in the late 1980s and early 2000s, the bodies appeared unremarkable. A man and a woman, buried together, fully articulated. The kind of floor burial that Bronze Age communities across Britain performed as foundation deposits, placing the dead beneath the living as a form of ancestral protection. Then the DNA results came back. The male skeleton was not one person, it was at least 3. The bones had been assembled from the remains of genetically distinct individuals, arranged in anatomically correct order, so precisely that nothing about the burial suggested anything unusual to visual inspection. The female skeleton was not one person either. It was assembled from the remains of at least 2 individuals. Someone in the Scottish Bronze Age had deliberately constructed composite human beings from the body parts of multiple people and buried them as if they were whole. Parker Pearson's team published the DNA findings in the Journal of Archaeological Science, and the discovery immediately raised a set of questions that archaeology has been working through ever since. The composite nature of the skeletons was not an accident of bone scattering or excavation disturbance. The assembly was too precise, the articulation too careful, the anatomical accuracy too consistent. Whoever built these bodies understood human anatomy, had access to remains from multiple individuals, and made deliberate choices about which parts to combine. The bones had been mummified before burial, almost certainly preserved in a peat bog, which would have maintained tissue integrity long enough for the composite bodies to be kept above ground, possibly for decades, possibly longer. Isotopic analysis suggested the mummies may have been curated for a significant period before their final interment. They were not freshly made and immediately buried. They were kept, used, displayed, or stored in some form for what may have been generations. The settlement at Clad Hallan was occupied for approximately 1,000 years, making it one of the longest continuously inhabited sites in British prehistory. The roundhouse beneath which the mummies were buried was a substantial structure, and floor burial at such sites typically carries the significance of dedicating the ancestors of a lineage to the foundation of the living space, anchoring the family to the ground literally through the bodies of the dead. If the composite mummies were foundation deposits, then whoever placed them there was making a statement about ancestry, about lineage, about identity that went beyond simple commemoration. No other confirmed examples of deliberate composite mummy construction are known from prehistoric Britain. Clad Hallen is, as far as current evidence shows, completely unique, and that uniqueness raises a set of uncomfortable possibilities. Parker Pearson's interpretation frames the composite construction as ancestral symbolism, the deliberate merging of multiple bloodlines or community identities into a single symbolic ancestor, a kind of political genealogy written in bone. In a society without writing, the physical body is the archive. A body that contains the remains of 3 lineages is a document making a claim about kinship, alliance, or authority that would have been legible to anyone in that community who understood the practice. This is a compelling and well-reasoned explanation, but it also requires us to accept a fairly extraordinary set of practices as routine. Exhuming the dead, selecting specific body parts, reassembling them with anatomical precision, preserving the result for potentially generations. Performing all of this with sufficient regularity and shared cultural understanding that the community apparently accepted composite ancestors as legitimate. How widespread was this practice? How many other Bronze Age floor burials, examined before ancient DNA analysis was available, might be composites that no one ever thought to test? The answer to that question could rewrite significant portions of British prehistoric social history, and we currently have no way of knowing it. Some researchers have begun asking whether the composite bodies were not just symbolic ancestors, but deliberate fictions, genealogical constructions designed to give a particular family or faction claim to multiple bloodlines simultaneously. In a world where ancestry determined power, land rights, and social standing, a body that contained the bones of 3 prestigious lineages was worth more than any single ancestor could be. Could Bronze Age communities have engaged in something we might recognize as identity fabrication, the manufacture of a false but physically convincing past? We may never know. The mummies of Clad Hallen have been re-examined, reanalyzed, and re-debated for decades. The DNA evidence is unambiguous. The interpretation remains open. And somewhere on the island of South Uist, there may be other roundhouses with other floor burials that no one has tested yet. From Scotland's assembled dead, we descend from the North Atlantic islands into the high frozen passes of the European Alps, following a man who walked into the mountains 5,300 years ago and never walked out. Utzi the Iceman. The date is sometime around 3300 BCE. A man in his mid to late 40s is climbing through the Ötztal Alps at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters. He is well equipped for the journey. He carries a copper axe, a longbow he has recently made but not yet finished, a quiver of arrows, a knife, and food he prepared before departing from the lower valleys. He has eaten a full meal within the last hour, red deer, ibex, einkorn wheat, and bracken fern, the kind of careful provisioning that suggests a planned, deliberate journey rather than a desperate flight. He is experienced at altitude. He knows this terrain. He has also, in the last several days, been in a serious fight. The web of flesh between his right thumb and index finger carries a deep cut, the classic injury of someone who grabbed an edged blade with a bare hand. And the clothing and equipment he carries bears the dried blood of at least 4 other people, none of whom appear to be him. Helmut and Erika Simon, German hikers, discovered the mummified body on September 19, 1991, protruding from the glacial ice of the Similon Glacier on the Austrian-Italian border. Initially mistaken for a modern casualty, Ötzi was eventually transferred to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where he has been studied by dozens of research teams over more than 3 decades. He is the most forensically examined prehistoric human being who has ever existed. For the first decade of analysis, the cause of death remained uncertain. Then in 2001, radiologist Paul Gossner and pathologist Eduard Egarter Wickel performed a new CT scan and found something that had been missed in every prior examination: a flint arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, embedded so deeply it was invisible without imaging. It had severed a subclavian artery. Ötzi bled out within minutes of being struck. He was shot from behind. Radiocarbon dating places his death at approximately 3300 BCE, making the Iceman roughly 5,300 years old. He was between 40 and 50 years of age at the time of death, elderly by Copper Age standards. His genome, fully sequenced in 2012 by a team including Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, revealed brown eyes, type O blood, lactose intolerance, a genetic predisposition to cardiovascular disease, and a genomic profile that bears no close relationship to modern alpine populations, suggesting the people of his community have left few or no direct descendants in the region today. The blood on his equipment was analyzed by a team led by Franco Rollo of the University of Camerino, published in 2003. It belonged to 4 distinct individuals. One source was identified on his knife. 2 sources were on a single arrow shaft, an arrow that had apparently been used, recovered, and reused. One source was on his coat. The positioning of these blood stains tells a story. Ötzi had recently been in violent contact with at least 4 other people. Some of those people had bled significantly. He had taken their blood with him into the mountains. His last meal's contents were determined from stomach analysis and the state of digestion at time of death. He had eaten approximately 30 to 60 minutes before the arrow hit him. He was not running when he died. He had stopped, rested, eaten. He was in a specific location at a specific time, and someone who knew where he would be or had followed him there fired an arrow into his back from a distance, and then apparently did nothing else. The copper axe was not taken. The food was not taken. The valuable longbow was not taken. His killer killed him and walked away. Mainstream forensic analysis concludes that Ötzi was assassinated, killed by someone who followed him specifically or ambushed him at a known location, for a reason personal enough to override the obvious value of the equipment left behind. The blood of 4 individuals on his gear suggests he had participated in or witnessed significant violence in the preceding days, possibly a conflict within or between communities in the lower valleys from which he had apparently fled or departed in haste. But the unanswered question is the one archaeology cannot reach. Why him specifically? His copper axe was right in 3300 BCE, an object of extraordinary value, the kind of possession that marked its owner as a person of significant status. A robber would have taken it without hesitation. His killer did not. That is not indifference. That is a statement. Someone wanted Ötzi dead, specifically and personally, badly enough to follow him into the high Alps, to wait for the right moment, and to leave behind wealth that represented in that world a small fortune. Whatever he had done, or whatever he knew, or whatever he represented to the person behind that arrow, it mattered more than copper. We will never know his name. We will never know the names of the 4 people whose blood he carried. We will never know the name of the archer. But we know, with the precision of modern forensic science applied to 5,000-year-old evidence, that he was murdered, and that somewhere in the valley below that glacier, someone knew they had done it and chose not to go back. From the cold certainty of a single Copper Age murder, we move south and east, deeper into Europe, into the Neolithic farmlands of southwestern Germany, where around the same era as Herxheim, a different community met a different but equally merciless end. The Talheim Death Pit. The year is approximately 5000 BCE. In what is now the Baden-Württemberg region of southwestern Germany, a community of linear pottery culture farmers, the people archaeologists call the LBK, have built their longhouses, tended their fields, raised their children, and buried their dead in the ways their culture has always prescribed. They are not isolated. LBK communities stretch from France to Poland, connected by shared pottery styles, shared building techniques, and shared beliefs. They know their neighbors. In the world of 5000 BCE, knowing your neighbors is not always a comfort. The Talheim site was discovered in 1983, uncovered during construction work on a private property. Archaeologists Joachim Wahl and Hans-Georg Koenig excavated the pit and published their findings in the journal Germania in 1987. What they found in that pit would become one of the most analyzed massacre assemblages in European prehistory. 34 people, thrown into a pit without ceremony, without orientation, without any of the ritual care that LBK communities typically applied to their dead. 16 children, 7 adult females, 9 adult males, and 2 individuals of indeterminate sex and age. Every demographic category of a small farming community represented. Men, women, children, and infants all in the same pit, so all treated with the same indifference. Wahl's analysis of the skeletal trauma revealed what made Talheim not just a massacre, but something more specific. The vast majority of skull injuries were delivered from behind or from the left rear of the victim, consistent with a right-handed attacker striking someone who was kneeling, prone, or restrained. The angle of impact was too consistent to reflect the chaos of combat. These were not people who died fighting. These were people who were subdued and then killed, one, by an attacker approaching from behind. The killing weapon was identified as a Schuhleistenkeile, a shoelast adze, a polished stone tool primarily used in LBK communities for woodworking. It was a common implement, not a dedicated weapon. Whoever carried out the Talheim killings used the tools of a farmer to execute 34 people with systematic efficiency. 1 or 2 individuals showed injuries consistent with a different implement, a pointed weapon, suggesting either multiple perpetrators or a different method applied selectively to certain victims. But the dominant pattern is unmistakable. Same tool, same angle, same approach, repeated 34 times. A 2006 isotopic study by Wolfgang Hack and colleagues published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences added a dimension to the Talheim story that reframed everything. Strontium isotope analysis of the tooth enamel from the adult females in the pit revealed that their signatures differed significantly from the males buried alongside them. The women were not local. They had grown up elsewhere, in a different geological region, and had come to this community, presumably as wives, partners, or captives from somewhere else. In a world of tight-knit LBK farming villages, being from a different place was a fact your teeth recorded permanently. The attackers killed the local men, they killed the local children, and they killed the foreign-born women too, rather than reclaiming them or returning them to their communities of origin. Whatever these women's original identities had been, whatever communities they had come from, the attackers saw no distinction worth preserving. Everyone in that pit was treated the same, killed from behind, thrown in, and left. Mainstream archaeology connects Talheim to a broader pattern of LBK violence that was beginning to emerge across Central Europe around 5000 BCE. Climate stress, population pressure, and competition for the best agricultural land appear to have pushed LBK communities into escalating intergroup conflict during this period. Talheim, alongside Aspern-Schletz in Austria and Herxheim in Germany, represents the extreme end of this violence, communities raided or destroyed by neighbors who had presumably once shared the same cultural traditions. But the precision of the Talheim killings is what resists easy categorization. Raids produce chaotic injury patterns. Combat produces wounds from multiple angles. What Talheim produced was a killing method so consistent it approaches the mechanical. Someone organized this. Someone directed the subduing of 34 people and then the systematic execution of each of them. In 5000 BCE, that level of coordination implies not just violence, but a chain of command. Some researchers have asked whether the answer to why the foreign-born women were killed alongside everyone else tells us something about how raiding parties in LBK Europe conceptualized their targets. Were they killing communities rather than individuals? Was the decision to kill made not about each person, but about the entire social unit, every member of a household or village designated for destruction regardless of origin, age, or identity? If so, what belief system or political logic supported that decision? And is the near-simultaneous appearance of multiple LBK massacre sites across Central Europe within a relatively narrow time window evidence of a contagion of violence, one atrocity inspiring or enabling another, cascading across the farming communities of prehistoric Europe until the entire LBK cultural network had effectively destroyed itself? From the Aibel, execution pits of Neolithic Germany, we travel north and west, across centuries and across the continent to the cold coast of Scandinavia, where a ring fort preserved in perfect silence tells the story of a single night that never ended. Sandby Borg. The island of Öland lies off the southeastern coast of Sweden, a flat limestone shelf in the Baltic Sea, its landscape shaped by centuries of grazing and wind. In the migration period, the era when the Western Roman Empire was coming apart and populations across Europe were in motion, Öland was dotted with ring forts, circular enclosures of stacked limestone with interior buildings, home to communities that had prospered, at least in part, through trade with the Roman world. Around 480 CE, give or take the imprecision of radiocarbon dating applied to this period, something happened at Sandby Borg, one of these ring forts that turned it from a living community into a sealed tomb. The site was first brought to serious archaeological attention following metal detector finds by local hobbyists. Systematic excavation began in 2011 under a team from Kalmar County Museum led by archaeologists including Helena Victor and Ludvig Papmael Dufay, with osteological analysis conducted by Clara Alfsdotter. The team quickly recognized they were dealing with something without a close parallel in migration period archaeology. They began calling it Sweden's Pompeii, and the comparison, while imperfect, captures something real about what they found. Sandby Borg measures approximately 80 meters in diameter, enclosed by a stone wall with several entrances. Excavation has so far covered roughly 10% of the interior. In that 10%, at least 26 individuals have been identified, all killed, none buried. The bodies lay exactly where they fell. An elderly man was found in a doorway, struck down as he either entered or attempted to flee. An infant's skeleton was recovered in close proximity to an adult, the positioning consistent with a parent who collapsed while holding or shielding the child. A horse skeleton was found inside one of the buildings, killed or trapped and never removed. Alf's daughter's skeletal analysis confirmed multiple types of perimortem trauma consistent with weapon strikes, sharp force injuries from sword or spear, and blunt force trauma. The attack was sudden, overwhelming, and apparently brief. There is no evidence of a prolonged siege, no fire damage to the walls, no sign that the defenders had time to organize a meaningful resistance. Whoever attacked Sandbyborg came in fast, with numbers sufficient to overwhelm the community before it could respond. Tien was done quickly enough to leave without taking the things they should, by any rational measure, have wanted. Because the things they left behind are remarkable. Gold finger rings, silver coins, Roman glass, bronze jewelry, artifacts representing significant wealth in migration period terms, scattered across the floors of the buildings, lying next to the bodies of the people who had owned them. In an era when portable wealth was the most logical and common target of raiding, the attackers of Sandbyborg took nothing. They killed everyone they could find and walked away. The site was never reoccupied. The surrounding agricultural land appears to have been abandoned. No neighboring community returned to loot the gold, which would have been known to exist by anyone with knowledge of Sandbyborg's prosperity. No one came back to bury the dead, which in migration period Scandinavian culture was not a minor omission. Leaving the dead unburied was understood to prevent the soul from finding rest, a profound spiritual violation. Whoever carried out this attack either believed that spiritual violation was part of the punishment, or was so completely indifferent to the victim's spiritual welfare that the taboo meant nothing to them. Mainstream archaeology frames the Sandbyborg massacre as a raid by a rival faction during the politically unstable migration period, possibly connected to the collapse of the trade networks and political hierarchies that had organized Oland's ring fort communities. The non-burial of the dead and the abandonment of wealth may reflect ideological or ritual dimensions of the attack that are no longer recoverable from the evidence available. But the complete absence of any subsequent use of the site asks a question that the raiding faction explanation doesn't fully answer. Raids are typically about gain, territorial, or material. A rival faction that destroyed Sandbyborg gained nothing from it. Yeah, they didn't take the land. They didn't take the gold. They didn't take the surviving members of the community as slaves or captives, at least not any that are archaeologically detectable. If the goal wasn't resources, what was it? Some researchers have begun describing what happened at Sandbyborg not as a raid, but as an erasure, a deliberate act of annihilation aimed not at gaining something from this community, but at removing it entirely from the landscape and from the network of relationships that constituted migration period society on Uland. The unburied dead, the untouched wealth, the permanent abandonment. These are not the residues of a violent acquisition. They are the residues of a verdict. Sandbyborg was not robbed, it was condemned. From Scandinavia's sealed tomb, while we travel south across Europe and then west across the Atlantic, arriving in the plains of North America, in a place and a time that most people, when they think of prehistoric violence, have never considered. The Crow Creek Massacre. The year is approximately 1325 CE, 167 years before Columbus. On the banks of the Missouri River in what is now central South Dakota, there is a fortified village. The people living there are ancestral Arikara, and they have built their community with the awareness that the world outside its walls can be dangerous. There is a defensive ditch around the perimeter. There is a palisade wall. This is not a community that is naive about violence. It did not help them. The mass grave at Crow Creek was uncovered accidentally in 1978 during construction work on the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation. The full archaeological excavation was carried out by a team from the University of South Dakota. and the definitive analysis was produced by physical anthropologist P. Willey, whose landmark monograph Prehistoric Warfare on the Great Plains, published in 1990, remains the foundational text on this site. The bones were later repatriated and reburied by the Crow Creek Sioux tribe in recognition of the fact that what had been found was not just an archaeological assemblage, but the remains of people with living descendants. Willey identified a minimum of 486 individuals from the mass grave. 486. That is not a skirmish. That is not a raid. That is the near total destruction of an entire community in a single event. Approximately 90% of the skulls showed evidence of scalping, cut marks running across the cranial vault consistent with the forcible removal of the scalp. Many individuals showed evidence of decapitation, with heads either missing or placed haphazardly among the remains of other individuals rather than with the corresponding body. Perimortem mutilation was documented across a significant portion of the assemblage. The evidence included severed extremities, and in some cases, trauma patterns consistent with the removal of the tongue identified through injuries to the hyoid bone in certain individuals. This is not the violence of combat. This is the violence of message sending. The village from which these people came was fortified. It had a ditch and a palisade wall, defensive infrastructure that represents real investment of time and labor built by a community that expected to need it. The wall was breached or overwhelmed. The ditch had not been enough. And then, with the village taken, the killing proceeded with a thoroughness that encompassed every demographic: infants, children, adolescents, adult males and females, and elderly individuals. The entire population that could be found was included. Tree ring records from the region document a prolonged and severe drought in the early 14th century, the devastating two agricultural communities dependent on the Missouri River corridor's productivity. As yields collapsed, competition for the remaining viable land intensified. The Missouri River Valley itself, with its reliable water access and fertile floodplain, was the most valuable real estate on the plains. Mainstream archaeology frames the Crow Creek Massacre as the extreme terminus of this escalating resource conflict, a catastrophic raid by a rival group or coalition of groups made desperate by the same environmental pressures that had weakened the Crow Creek community itself. But the nature of the mutilation exceeds what resource competition requires. Scalping, decapitation, and tongue removal are not efficient. They take time. They require specific intent towards specific body parts. They communicate something, to survivors if any remained, to neighboring communities who would eventually learn what had happened here, and possibly to spiritual forces that the perpetrators believed were watching. Someone wanted this to mean something beyond the killing. And then, perhaps most surprisingly, the dead were buried, not immediately and not by people who treated the bodies with care, but eventually someone returned to this site, gathered the remains of 486 people, and placed them in a mass grave. Who did that? If the attacking community had destroyed Crow Creek entirely, there may have been no survivors to perform this act. Did the attackers return? Did a neighboring community, unaffiliated with the violence, eventually come to put the dead in the ground? The burial is, in its own strange way, as mysterious as the massacre itself. Some researchers have asked whether the return to bury the dead reflects a belief system that separated the obligation of the living to the dead from the act of killing them, a cosmology in which even enemies once killed were owed some form of funerary acknowledgement. If so, it implies a moral framework sophisticated enough to hold both the act of annihilation and the act of burial as simultaneously necessary, a worldview in which you could destroy a community and still owe its dead something. We will never fully recover the human reality of what happened at Crow Creek in 1325. The bones have been reburied. The perpetrators left no record. The survivors, if there were any, left no account. What remains is the number, 486. And the knowledge that in the century before European contact, on the American plains, something this organized, this total, and this deliberate was possible. From the Missouri River, we travel back across the Atlantic and deep into time, to a cave in Croatia that holds evidence of violence so ancient it predates our own species' arrival in Europe by tens of thousands of years. The Krapina Neanderthal bones. The year is approximately 130,000 BCE. The last interglacial period is at its peak, the climate warmer than it has been in millennia, and in the river valleys of what is now northern Croatia, Neanderthals are living in the rock shelters and cave entrances that provide the best combination of protection and access to the landscape. At a site called Krapina, overlooking a river valley in the Zagorje region, a group of Neanderthals are present. We know this because their bones are there. More than 900 bone fragments, representing the remains of somewhere between 13 and more than 80 individuals, depending on which counting methodology is applied to the extraordinary density of the assemblage. And those bones bear marks. Croatian paleontologist Dragutin Gorjanović Kromberger discovered and excavated the Krapina rock shelter between 1899 and 1905, through making it one of the foundational sites in the history of paleoanthropology. The bones went to the Croatian Natural History Museum in Zagreb, where they remain. Gorjanović Kromberger, examining the cut marks on the bones in the earliest years of the 20th century, proposed cannibalism. Decades of subsequent researchers argued otherwise. The debate in modified form has never fully resolved. In 1999, researchers including Jill Cook reanalyzed the cut marks using scanning electron microscopy, the kind of high-resolution imaging that was not available to earlier investigators. The SEM analysis confirmed that the marks were humanly made and intentional, produced by stone tools applied to bone with purpose, not the result of animal gnawing, geological processes, or any form of natural modification. The marks occurred at specific anatomical locations consistent with deliberate, skilled defleshing of the body. Someone who knew how bodies were structured had removed the flesh from these bones with intent and precision. The long bones showed percussion fractures consistent with marrow extraction, the same pattern of controlled breakage produced when you strike a bone at a specific angle to split it and access the nutritional and calorie-dense marrow inside. This technique appears at prehistoric sites involving the processing of deer, cattle, and other large animals. It appears here applied to Neanderthals. In 2017, Davorka Radovčić and colleagues at the Croatian Natural History Museum published a study identifying 3 eagle talons from the Krapina assemblage that showed use wear patterns consistent with having been strung or mounted as jewelry. These talons, dating to approximately 130,000 years ago, represent what is currently the oldest known ornament produced by any human species. The same assemblage that contains defleshed and marrow-extracted human bones also contains the earliest evidence of symbolic personal adornment in the history of humanity. This combination is what makes Krapina genuinely irreducible to a single explanation. Cannibalism is one possibility, and the processing evidence is consistent with it. But a rival interpretation, developed by Mary Russell in the 1980s and expanded by subsequent researchers, proposes that the cut marks are consistent with secondary burial practices, the deliberate defleshing of the dead as a funerary ritual. Many human cultures across history have practiced excarnation, the removal of flesh from the dead as part of mortuary ceremony intended not as consumption, but as preparation of the bones for a secondary stage of burial or commemoration. Under this interpretation, the Krapina Neanderthals were honoring their dead, not eating them. But the marrow extraction remains. Excarnation does not require cracking the bones open. Defleshing a body for funerary purposes leaves the bones intact. What you find at Krapina is bones that have been defleshed and then broken open for their contents. That is two distinct acts, not one, and the second act does not fit neatly into any known funerary framework. Some paleoanthropologists have begun asking whether the categories we bring to Krapina, cannibalism on one hand, ritual burial on the other, are simply inadequate to describe what Neanderthals actually did. The eagle talon jewelry tells us that these were beings capable of symbolic thought, of attributing meaning to objects beyond their immediate utility, of creating and wearing adornment. Could their relationship with the dead have been symbolic in ways that combined elements we separate into distinct categories? Could consuming parts of the dead have been, for them, a form of ancestral communion, a ritual act of incorporation rather than simple nutrition? The processing of human bodies and the creation of ornamental jewelry occurring at the same site at the same time 130,000 years ago, suggest a cognitive and cultural complexity that we have barely begun to map. We do not know if the individuals at Krapina were killed by members of their own group or died by other means and were then processed. We do not know whether the marrow was consumed or used for some other purpose. We do not know whether this was a regular practice or a response to extraordinary circumstances. What we know is that Neanderthals, long before modern humans arrived in Europe, were making deliberate, skilled, intentional decisions about what to do with the bodies of the dead. And those decisions left marks on bone that we are still reading, still arguing about, still unable to fully explain. From a Croatian cave 130,000 years old, we travel west across the continent and forward thousands of years, to the banks of an ancient lagoon in the East African interior, where human beings stood at the edge of the world that was ending and the world that was beginning, and did something to each other that archaeology only found by accident. Nataruk. 10,000 years ago, the landscape of what is now West Turkana in northwestern Kenya looked nothing like it does today. The region was lush, watered by a lagoon connected to a system of lakes that the retreating glaciers of the last ice age had fed for millennia. There were fish and animals and fresh water in a post-glacial world where all three were becoming increasingly precious as the climate warmed and landscapes shifted. People were here, living at the edge of the water, hunter-gatherers who had not yet made the transition to agriculture, had not yet built permanent villages, had not yet domesticated animals. And they were the first people we know of to organize themselves into a group for the purpose of killing another group with systematic, deliberate, total violence. The site was excavated between 2009 and 2012 by a team led by Dr. Marta Mirazon-Lar of Cambridge University's Leverhulme Center for Human Evolutionary Studies. The remains were surface exposed, brought up by the erosion of ancient lakebed sediments, and recovered before further weathering could destroy them. Lar's team published their findings in the journal Nature in January 2016, and the response from the scientific community was immediate and significant. The paper was not just describing a massacre. It was entering one of the deepest and most consequential debates in the study of human behavior. Where does warfare come from? Radiocarbon dating places the massacre at approximately 9,500 to 10,500 years before present. 12 complete or partial skeletons were recovered, with evidence suggesting additional individuals who were not preserved or not recovered. Among the 12, the evidence of violence was extensive and specific. Skulls showed fractures consistent with blunt force trauma from clubs or stone hammers, delivered with force sufficient to collapse the cranial vault. At least one individual had obsidian bladelets embedded in the skull, projectile weapons used at close range. These were not injuries from falls or accidents. The pattern, the location, the nature of the fractures placed them unmistakably in the category of deliberate, lethal violence. 4 individuals were found with their wrists positioned in configurations that are anatomically inconsistent with natural death or the postures of decomposition. Their hands were bound at the time of death. Binding takes time. It requires cooperation between attackers. It implies a decision to capture, restrain, and then kill rather than simply to strike during chaotic combat. But this was organized. The skeleton designated by Lars' team as a woman in the late stages of pregnancy showed perimortem fractures to her knees, hands, and skull. She was alive and likely restrained when she was killed. Her unborn child died with her. The positioning of her body face down in the ancient mud suggested she had been struck from above or behind, unable to turn or flee. Mainstream archaeology has situated the Nataruk massacre within a framework of resource competition among hunter-gatherer groups. The lagoon represented exceptional value in a world of shifting water sources. 2 groups competing for access to this resource came into catastrophic conflict. The violence, while extreme, fits a pattern observable in other animal species when high-value resources become simultaneously scarce and concentrated. Where the mainstream position does not deny the horror of Nataruk, it explains it. But the binding of the victims complicates the resource competition model in ways that have not been fully resolved. Binding someone in a hunter-gatherer context implies a level of social organization, a chain of command, a shared tactical decision that goes beyond the spontaneous violence of a territorial skirmish. It implies capture, deliberate restraint, and then execution as a chosen act rather than an outcome of combat. Someone decided to bind these people. That decision required prior agreement among multiple individuals about what they were going to do. That is planning. And planning, applied to mass killing of specific human beings, is what we call organized warfare. If Nataruk represents organized warfare among hunter-gatherers 10,000 years ago, before agriculture, before permanent settlement, before the accumulation of property that most theories of warfare require as a precondition, then one of the foundational assumptions of the social sciences is wrong. Warfare is not a product of civilization. It is not a disease that came with surplus and ownership. It may be something older, something that was present before we were fully human in the sense we usually mean by that phrase. Something we carried with us out of the deep past. Some researchers who have engaged with the Nataruk evidence have begun asking a harder question than when warfare began. They are asking what it means that it began so early, and whether the social intelligence required to organize the killing at Nataruk to plan, coordinate, subdue, and execute a group of specific human beings is not separable from the same social intelligence that makes cooperation, trade, kinship, and culture possible. Is the capacity for organized violence not a corruption of human social intelligence, but a product of it? Arising from exactly the same cognitive capacities that make us capable of everything we most value about ourselves. We do not know who carried out the Nataruk massacre. No remains of the attacking group have been found. We do not know what happened to the members of the group who are missing, who may have been taken captive and whose bodies are somewhere else entirely, or may simply not have been preserved. We do not know why the dead were left unburied, whether the attackers prevented it, or whether there were no survivors left to bury anyone. What we know is that 10,000 years ago, on the edge of an African lagoon, human beings bound other human beings with their hands behind their backs and killed them. And then those killed people lay in the mud for 10,000 years, waiting to be found. They have been found. Their story is incomplete. Their question is not. 10 sites, 4 continents, 130,000 years. And across all of it, the same fundamental recognition keeps surfacing. The capacity for organized, deliberate, systematic violence is not an aberration in human history. It is woven into it, present before agriculture, before civilization, before writing, before any of the things we typically point to as the origins of human complexity. Mainstream archaeology offers coherent and well-supported explanations for most of what these sites contain. Resource competition, political consolidation, ritual practice, funerary custom, the pressures of climate change, and population movement. These explanations deserve to be taken seriously because they are grounded in evidence and because dismissing them in favor of more dramatic alternatives would be intellectually dishonest. But honest engagement with the evidence also requires acknowledging what the mainstream explanations sometimes leave in the margins. The bound hands at Natarok, 10,000 years before the first city, seen the composite bodies assembled with anatomical precision in a Scottish Bronze Age roundhouse. The 46-year-old man with 4 people's blood on his coat, shot from behind on an alpine pass, his copper axe left beside his body by a killer who didn't want it. The 500-year seal on a Swedish ring fort full of gold that no one came back for. These are not clean data points that fit neatly into resource competition or ritual consolidation. They are the places where the explanation and the evidence are still in conversation, where the question has not yet been answered to full satisfaction. The philosophical weight of these 10 sites is not just about violence, it is about depth. Human beings have been capable of organizing themselves for deliberate, systematic killing for at least as long as we have been recognizably human, and possibly longer if Krapina's evidence is interpreted as violence. That inheritance belongs to all of us. Every living person is the descendant of communities that survived whatever Crow Creek or Sandby Borg or Nataruk represented. The people on both sides of those events, the killed and the killers, are our ancestors. Archaeology cannot always tell us which is which. What these sites ask of us, collectively, is that we resist the comfortable version of the past. The version in which violence is an interruption of human progress rather than a thread running through it. The version in which atrocity is the exception rather than a documented feature of every era and every continent we have examined closely enough to find the bones. You sat with these sites, you stayed long enough to hear what the evidence actually says rather than what we might prefer it to say. That is not a common thing. Most people walk through museums and see artifacts behind glass and feel nothing in particular. You made it to the end of 130,000 years of evidence that the past was not simpler than the present, only less visible. That matters. Because history understood clearly, without flinching, is the only kind of history that is actually useful. If this is the kind of question you want to keep asking, subscribe. This channel is built for the people who stay until the end, who want the evidence and not just the story. And tell us in the comments, which of these 10 sites unsettled you the most? Which one do you think has the explanation that mainstream archaeology is least willing to fully confront? The bones do not lie. They do not exaggerate. They do not have an agenda. They simply wait in the earth, under the glaciers, beneath the desert sand, until someone patient enough and honest enough comes along to read what is written in them. What is written there is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. It is simply true. From the shore of a Kenyan lagoon at the end of the last ice age to the mud brick pyramid of the Moche, the same voice speaks across 10,000 years of silence. We were here, we did this, and we were human beings when we did it. The question of what that means is the one that no final answer can close. It is the question that makes you come back. It is the question this channel was made to sit with. Subscribe and keep asking it.